we are in the aftermath of the 20th anniversary of 9/11, and everyone is looking at what happened at the time, not just what happened with getting out of Afghanistan now. And so we have a couple of experts to talk about the idea of how we got into that war in Afghanistan, and of course, the war in Iraq after 9/11 originally. So without any further ado, Jim, why don't you introduce those guests?
I sure will, and we are certainly fortunate to have two experts who have spent considerable time thinking about these issues. First, let me turn to Jeff Engel. Professor Jeffrey Engel is the founding director of the Center for Presidential History at Southern Methodist University here in Dallas, Texas. He's the author and editor of 13 books, including one of my favorite, When the World Seemed New, George H.W. Bush and the End of the Cold War. He's also the author of, or co-author of, a book called The Last Card, Inside George W. Bush's Decision to Surge in Iraq. He's joined by journalist author Robert Draper. Draper is a writer at large for the New York Times Magazine, and he's also a contributing writer to National Geographic. We're going to be focusing on two of his books. One, Dead Certain, The Presidency of George W. Bush, and his most recent book is To Start a War, How the Bush Administration Took America into Iraq. So Robert, I'd like to turn to you first, if I may, and let's just establish some base facts. Was there any linkage between Al-Qaeda and the government of Saddam Hussein in Iraq?
There was no meaningful linkage. There had been loose associations over a period of, say, 15 years or so, but none that could be called operational relationships to the extent that one would have any reasonable fear that the two would collude and that Saddam, for example, would share his supposed weapons of mass destruction with Afghanistan. So no, that pretext for war was not supported by the facts.
And one of the things that you highlight in your book is maybe even hours, if not days after 9/11, there were people in the Bush administration who said, let's find the linkage.
Sure. Yeah, that's it. There had been people really from September 11th onward who were mentioning Iraq, but at a very important meeting in Camp David on September the 14th, just 3 days after 9/11, Deputy Secretary of State Paul Wolfowitz suggested in front of Bush's war cabinet that perhaps they shouldn't be focusing on Afghanistan at all, that they should be going straight into Iraq and launching an attack there, since, in his argument, Iraq was really the head of the snake when it came to worldwide terrorism. Again, something that was not supported by the facts, something that instead reflected a longtime animus and passion that Wolfowitz had towards dethroning Saddam Hussein. But to your point, very early and very often, Iraq was invoked, despite the fact that there was no evidence of any kind that Saddam Hussein had anything to do with the 9/11 plot.
Well, when you look at some of these individuals like Wolfowitz and Douglas Feith, and of course, Vice President Cheney and Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, were they just angry that George H.W. Bush made the decision not to topple Saddam Hussein back in the original Gulf War in 1992?
That's a great question, and I think the answer depends on who you're directing that towards. In the case of Dick Cheney, who after all had been the Secretary of Defense back then, Cheney at the time was quite sanguine about the decision to curtail the Gulf War and leaving it essentially at the gates of Baghdad. We had an international charter after all, and we had this broad coalition, but that coalition was based on the charter that what we are there to do is to rout Saddam and his troops from Kuwait, not to engage in a kind of leadership change. So Cheney, like others, I think, was of the belief that that Saddam's people would take care of things for themselves, and that did not come to pass. And so he regretted that. But really, all the way up until the time that he became George W. Bush's running mate, he was espousing the belief that it was the right policy at the time. Paul Wolfowitz had a different point of view, and Wolfowitz was largely born out of the belief that we had left the Shia to be slaughtered by Saddam Hussein, and that amounted to a kind of betrayal. Doug Feith, the Undersecretary for Policy, was of the view that Saddam Hussein in Iraq posed the #1 threat to Israel, which was a proximate concern of Feith's, and that for that reason, we should take Saddam out.
Yeah, Jeff, the interesting thing about you and Robert both is that you've both written about George W. Bush, President George W. Bush. And he has either gotten credit for some of the things that happened, or in many cases gotten the blame for things that happened. Give us some of your insights into him a little bit personally, number one, but secondly, give us some history, some perspective about how presidents at that time, 20 years ago, made decisions on whether we went to war or not, and whether that was in fact constitutional.
Those are both very large questions. I'll try to tackle them in turn. George W. Bush was a president who, frankly, came to office with less experience, certainly on the international stage, than we typically see for presidents. He had a relatively thin resume, but he was, of course, very well connected. He had grown up in politics, his father being, of course, the president of the United States, and several of the members of his own cabinet, as Robert just said, were actually people who had previously served with his father or previously served in high-level government. So he came in essentially to office as an agent of change focused on domestic affairs. It's really quite dramatic how much he was concerned with education and with reforming, in his mind, the soul of the nation, with a brand of conservatism he called compassionate conservatism. And, much like Woodrow Wilson, to be honest, he came into office never expecting that foreign policy was going to be the principal thing through which he is remembered. And as a consequence, I think that really tells us a lot about how presidents react to the world and also lead their country into conflicts. And of course, we can't even say lead their country into war, because of course, only Congress has the power to declare war and has not done so since 1945. So at the end of the Cold War period, actually across the entire Cold War period, and then to 9/11, when Bush was in charge, we really have a period where presidents are basically unilateral actors, and Congress only comes and perhaps approves or sometimes rarely disapproves after the president has already made a decision for conflict.
Well, one of the things that Robert has written about is that President Bush was the kind of person who would ask other people questions, Jeff, and try to get their opinions. Do you find that that was the case in the time that you've interacted with him?
I do, but I do want to put a note of caution. I'm perpetually impressed by how presidents seem to gather attention in the room and seem to gather, whether they're presidents at the time or post-presidents. A number of times you read people's memoirs, for example, and talk about the incredible magnitude of a president, that they are, every eye is focused on them, is astounding. And the same thing with their questions, that I think historically presidents ask questions, some more than others, but overwhelmingly the people who work for the president and serve the president and whose entire careers are based upon the president's success tend to view those questions perhaps with a little bit more generosity than others. A number of times I have read across many presidencies, and George W. Bush's in particular, subordinates who said he was an incredibly insightful question asker, is, I think, above the statistical average that one would expect. So I think Bush did, in fact, ask a lot of questions. Whether he asked the right questions or not, the people in the room certainly always thought he was asking the right questions or were wanting to tell him that he was asking the right questions.
Well, I think that's a good way of putting it. And Robert, I think in your book, you said that this was the worst foreign policy decision in the U.S. history. Am I right about that? And if that's right, how did this group get together, and what sort of, let's just say, confirmation bias might have been at work here when they were making this decision to start a war?
Sure. I don't actually explicitly say that it was the worst decision ever. I think that's such a subjective judgment, and it's not one that I engaged in with my book. It's certainly the manner in which they went about the decision and the consequences of the manner in which they went out that decision were disastrous for sure. And I would take slight issue with the characterization that that my book would suggest that George W. Bush eagerly asked questions. He did until he didn't, and I think Jeffrey was trying to get at that too. That Bush was very incisive, was and is, I believe, at unraveling someone's intellectual thread, finding the weakness in a particular argument. What he was less good about was searching out for those, and this kind of gets to what you're alluding to there, Dennis. searching for those alternative arguments that might step outside his own biases. It's now a matter of record that at no point did the Bush War Cabinet ever have any kind of debate on the advisability of going to war. Now, President Bush would say around that time, and has said since then, well, I didn't need such a debate because I knew where everyone stood. First, I'm not sure he knew where everyone stood, but secondly, even if he did, a debate of some sort would have given him the opportunity then to see if certain person's arguments intellectually held up. What did not happen was that at no juncture did his national security advisor, Condoleezza Rice, bring into the Oval Office someone who had a dissenting point of view about the advisability of going to war. He never heard that argument tested at all. And so that is in and of itself a remarkable failure, one for which a lot of people, I think, deserve to take responsibility for, but ultimately it falls at the feet of the commander-in-chief.
Robert, talk about the dynamics between then Secretary of State Colin Powell and George W. Bush, because I think it's a fair statement, a fair assessment to say that Secretary Powell was a reluctant warrior.
When Bush won the presidency by the skin of his teeth by 537 votes in Florida with very little mandate, and as Jeffrey has pointed out, very little in the way of foreign policy experience, he leaned very heavily on his first pick in the cabinet, Secretary of State Colin Powell, because Powell was an immensely popular man and probably the most popular political figure in America at that point, and who had a remarkable foreign policy experience well. Unfortunately, what transpired then was an inability for those two to forge a real relationship. I think part of that was due to the fact that the new president had a kind of edgy feeling about this man who not only had in a lot of ways more political clout than the president of the United States did, but who also Bush wondered from time to time was looking after his, Colin Powell's own agenda. And others like Karl Rove, Bush's top advisor, would sort of play to that and suggest that Powell maybe still had his eye on a presidential run, which Powell in fact did not. But this had consequences. It wasn't just, Powell didn't win a personality contest. It meant that when Bush was turning to people for advice, he first went to Condoleezza Rice, who was a close friend of his in addition to being his national security advisor. He went to his Vice President Cheney, and he went to the Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld. Now, the last two men I've just mentioned viewed the world and viewed lots of things very, very differently from Powell, and were constantly at loggerheads. The ultimate, how this ultimately played out then was that Powell was boxed out of the decision-making process, had to kind of scratch and claw to get his way in. And of course, ultimately, what everyone remembers Powell for is that when Bush wanted to sell the idea of the war, of the importance of the threat of Saddam Hussein and curtailing that threat to an international audience, he turned to his most popular political figure, Colin Powell, to give the ill-fated speech on February the 3rd, 2003 at the United Nations. But once again, he wasn't using Powell, the so-called reluctant warrior, to figure out how to wage war. He was using him to figure out how to sell the war.
And rather than being boxed out, then Colin Powell was boxed in.
Powell was boxed in because now he had committed himself to the war. He had committed himself to the proposition of him being one of the marketers in chief of the war. And for that matter, he had committed himself to the claims that were made in that speech that turned out to be almost totally wrong. That speech in itself was one disastrous intelligence failure. And Powell ended up feeling quite duped by the process.
We're going to come back to that in a minute, but I want to turn to Professor Engel and go back and ask you to bore down a little bit more on the legality of some of the military action, because shortly, days after 9/11, there was near unanimous approval in Congress for the authorization to use military force. Talk with us about that, if you would.
Well, this is something which presidents have done essentially since 1945. To be honest, they've done this throughout American history, but in particular since 1945, of presidents deciding because of exigent circumstances, because of the need for speed, or because of the need for a president to coordinate with allies, that a president could go to war, essentially use military force at their own discretion. And the days after 9/11, remember when there's still smoke coming up from the Pentagon and the Twin Towers, and there's still a whole lot of concern and worry and wonder within American circles over who exactly had done this and who the enemy was. Congress, not surprisingly, gave the president the authority to essentially do what he already had the authority to do. which was to go and try to find who this was. And this was remarkably one of the most broad and far-ranging authorizations, I think, in all of American history, that we really have not really even come to terms with how broad it is, because previous Congresses, when endorsing or giving authorization or approving after the fact of a president's action, have really said, yes, we believe you're doing the right thing in a place like Vietnam, or we believe you're doing the right thing in Bosnia. The global war on terror that Bush proposed and enacted after that authorization was just that, global. It was unending in scope and in target. Essentially, it gave him the ability, which he would have taken anyway, to go anywhere, to attack or detain anyone in any place around the world, so long as he could justify to his own lawyers, at least, that this was connected in some way to the attacks of 9/11. So unfortunately, that was an authorization that continued to be used for subsequent presidencies, because what president wouldn't want that power, essentially the unlimited power from Congress to do whatever they want in the military sphere as commander-in-chief. It's a remarkable distance from what the founders would have imagined possible, or I think would have endorsed.
So in fact, those 60 words that you talk about, not one country was identified by name.
Yeah, the entire world essentially was the Bush's purview. And it's really, again, I can't say anything more than it was remarkable, because that this—
So what's the standing of it now?
Right now, there's debate to remove it, but the president still has essentially most of the authority that was left. And I think one better way to think about that question actually is to say, does it matter whether the president still has authority? Because the way we've set up, especially during the Cold War, because of the need for presidential speed and decision-making, we've set up a system where presidents can essentially move American forces into combat or attack anyone around the world at their own personal discretion. And then, only then, would Congress subsequently decide if they cared, if they wanted to do anything about it. And let me give you actually a great example of this, not from this Iraq war, but from the previous Iraq war, from the one in 1991 that George H.W. Bush was commander-in-chief in. We have Bush's personal diary now, which is just a remarkable document. And time and again in his personal diary, and this is corroborated by other people at the time and by documents at the time, Bush, in the lead up to that war, as Congress and the Senate in particular were going to debate whether or not to endorse all the action he had done in building up forces against Iraq to then unleash those forces, Bush said time and again, I don't really care what Congress says, because I'm going to go to war, period, because I think it's right. And then he says very curiously, and I think this is very insightfully, he says, you know, here's the thing, my generals tell me we're going to win this war in a matter of days, if not weeks. Just let Congress try to impeach me when I have a sky-high approval rating. And frankly, he was right both on the length of that war, and he was right that he left it as a consequence with a sky-high approval rating. So essentially, Bush thumbed his nose at the entire process of that the Constitution outlines of giving congressional sanction for war.
Well, that's the kind of thing that bothers a lot of people, including me, of course, is the idea of a president, any president, taking that position, given the, in my opinion, the lack of constitutionality about it. But one of the issues I have here about this decision about going to war, Robert, and that is the first thing that I think was done was to go to Afghanistan for reasons you're going to tell us, but also the idea of the war on terror, for some of us, seemed like one of the stupidest things ever said in history, because you don't go to war on a tactic. Terror has been around since the beginning of the world. And how do you ever define what you're trying to do, much less, as Jeff just said, where you're trying to do it? So talk about the war on terror and the other issue I mentioned.
Well, yeah, Dennis, there were, I mean, people forget this, but at the time, there were people making the very point that you're now raising, that terrorism is a tactic, and how do you go to war against that? I think, though, that one has to recall that all of this came to be not just because we were attacked on September 11th, but because the Bush administration was completely unprepared for that attack and was essentially caught with its collective pants down, despite the fact that the intelligence community had been issuing increasingly dire warnings about al-Qaeda's ability and desire to launch such an attack. They never, of course, had the coordinates as to where and when it would take place, but rarely do we get that. the Bush administration, I think, therefore, reacted with a kind of doubled down a sense of determination that nothing like this ever happened again on American shores. But at the time, there were people saying, "War on terror, really? I mean, do you mean the Irish Republican Army?" I mean, that's. I think that they were trying to be careful. The Bush administration was in not saying the war against Islamic extremism, and I think that Bush walked this tightrope as adroitly as a president could. It's the kind of thing that in recent years we would not have seen, but we certainly saw in the Bush administration that after 9/11, he took pains to say, "We are not at war against Islam. This is a noble religion." He made a point of going to a mosque. He made a point of bringing religious leaders of Islam to the White House, and made a point as well of talking what I was saying out loud, what I'm describing to you now, in his fabled speech on September the 20th before the joint session. So, Bush was not wanting to underscore or lead anyone to believe that we were going after Islam. But at the same, and so I think that perhaps led them to resort to a rather clumsy nomenclature of war on terror. But it's not only just a nomenclatural problem, it's a temporal problem, as Jeffrey pointed out, because it by its very nature is a war one cannot win, and therefore was almost certain to be a war that would become protracted, become expanded, and lead us into places that had nothing whatsoever to do with the September 11th attack.
I had I guess at this point, dubious honor of participating in a group of scholars who were brought in around 2004, 2005 to see if we could come up with a better name than War on Terror or Global War on Terror, with the terrible acronym of GWAT. And because the Pentagon realized this is marketed very badly for its ultimate purposes. And I have to admit, nobody in the room could come up with a better name, which is, we all thought the name stunk, but we couldn't come up with anything better as a descriptor that would really be useful for the Pentagon in its broader approach for describing the war.
Yeah, Jeffrey, we have just a few minutes left, and I'd like you to elaborate more on sort of the abrogation of responsibility by the U.S. Congress, particularly the Senate.
I think we can move that, first of all, beyond the question of war and peace. I think one of the things that we see over the course of the 20th century, in particular in the rise of the imperial presidency, is that Congress essentially dictates what should happen and then says to the executive, "You guys go do it." So all kinds of power have flown to the executive at this point. But in the matter of war and peace, I really think that Congress has decided to abrogate authority and abrogate its constitutional role for several reasons, not least of which is the president needs to act quickly in times of nuclear war, or certainly in times of terrorism. But more importantly than that, there really is very little to no upside for a politician to critique a commander-in-chief, even in the midst of an unpopular war these days. In the long wake of Vietnam, Americans have told themselves the need to support the troops at any cost. And oftentimes that support of the troops is unfortunately conflated with supporting the war that they are fighting, that criticizing the policy that they are undertaking is in some way going to hurt morale and therefore hurt the troops. So it's very, very hard to get any politician, or certainly any coalition of politicians in Congress, to say, "I want to stake my political career on fighting against a flag-waving Marine in his Humvee," essentially is how it would be portrayed. So yeah. I think that Congress, in essence, has abrogated its responsibility in every single measure of this war, of the war on terror, as we described, badly named, that they've basically given the president a blank check by and large, and not even sought to see how the check was spent very well afterwards.
Well, that's a good point. And I'm not going to get into what they've done since Vietnam to try to convince people like me and other community leaders to be pro-war all the time and pro-defense. I went on a joint civilian conference that they focused with me and a group of people all over the world, trying to convince them and to support the troops. And that's I didn't wear my badge, but I've got a thing here that says support the troops. And it's all of selling the military. Now, in just a minute or two that we have left here in this particular segment, and we're going to do 2 segments for that person watching, Robert, I'll ask you, how do you think America's foreign policy changed as a result of the bombing on 9/11/2001?
Well, I mean, it's changed a couple of times, Dennis, but certainly we began to kind of re-engage with the world, but not in an entirely healthy way. I mean, we began to see, you know, as President Bush himself said it, the paradigm became you're either for us or you're against us, and of course, that's a very complicated situational thing with any foreign policy, with any of even some of our best allies. You know, we get crosswise with from time to time, and so the notion that we would draw lines so starkly was notable. But then, you know, came the Iraq War, and I do think that also has created its own dynamics since then. I think the succeeding administrations became very, very leery of acting, in particular in the Middle East, seeing what kind of overreach can take place. And yet, ironically, as we've been sort of alluding to, and which we'll likely talk about in the second segment, that did not stop us from protracting a 20-year war, right, in Afghanistan. And so even as we saw the dangers of creeping commitment, there we were continuing to perpetuate it.
You're absolutely right. And we will be talking about that in the next program. Two wars that will always be described, unfortunately, as forever wars. And what we shouldn't forget is they're also described as wars of choice. I want to thank both of you for joining us, and we'll be right back with our next program. And as always, I want to thank all of you for watching, because we're here talking about things that matter with you, people who care. I'm Jim Falk with Dennis McCuistion.